All right, let's dive right into this explainer. Today, we're going to take a really fascinating look under the hood of modern political media. We're looking at how a highly partisan broadcast uses stark contrasts and curated clips to build a seriously compelling, albeit polarizing narrative. We're going to break down this specific source material to see exactly how these arguments are engineered, piece by piece, to shape audience perception. To really understand how this broadcast is built, we'll break it down into 5 quick parts. We've got framing the culture war, the foreign policy narrative, the economic messaging battle, critiquing political strategy, and finally the local teaser. Let's jump in. Part 1. Framing the culture war, or the us versus them dichotomy. The source material comes right out of the gate with this really fierce us versus them framing. Just look at the contrast they set up here. The broadcast paints the left as a kind of sermon squad that's just allergic to fun. They describe a White House Pride event as alienating, tragically tacky, and way more focused on lecturing people than uniting them. But then, on the flip side, they frame the right as the party of everyday, normal American patriotism. They use a White House UFC event as their prime example, highlighting the American grit, flags everywhere, singing the national anthem. It's a very intentional juxtaposition. And to really lock that framing in, they highlight this specific quote from a left-wing protester outside the event. The host plays this audio clip to make the argument that the opposing side is leaning entirely on alienating attacks, literally calling half the country fascists, instead of building a winning political brand. The message they're pushing is unmistakable. One side is throwing a backyard barbecue, while the other side is just yelling through a megaphone. Now here's where it gets really interesting. How exactly does this domestic culture clash connect to global foreign policy? Well, the broadcast doesn't want to just stick to backyard disputes. They actually use the energy from that UFC fight to pivot straight into analyzing international leadership. Which brings us to Section 2, the foreign policy narrative, focusing on the hustle and the deal. So let's see how they build this foreign policy narrative. It all starts with a huge emphasis on the former president's sheer stamina. They lay out this pretty wild timeline to impress the viewer. Picture this. He's ringside at the UFC event until 1 a.m., wheels up on Air Force One by early morning, and touching down at the G7 summit in Geneva later that exact same day. The broadcast praises this grueling schedule to show how an 80-year-old leader is just totally outworking people half his age. And this all sets the stage for his arrival in Geneva to tackle a massive Iran peace deal. Once we're in Geneva, the broadcast really drills down into the mechanics of this proposed deal. According to Vice President J.D. Vance, who they quote here, the agreement extends a ceasefire for 60 days, using a very strict performance-based structure. Step 1, Iran has to actually eliminate its stockpile of enriched material and allow a super rigorous verification regime. Only after they do that do we hit Step 2, the U.S. granting sanctions relief and access to the global economy. They're deliberately highlighting these steps to push back against other media claims that the U.S. is essentially just backing up a Brinks truck full of cash. So the core argument here is perfectly captured in this quote: no compliance, no cash. They're framing this strictly as a show us, don't trust us kind of agreement. The logic is simple, right? You wouldn't pay a contractor before the house is built, and you shouldn't hand over the keys before the check actually clears. It's a framing clearly designed to make this foreign policy approach look tough, pragmatic, and highly effective. Moving right along to Section 3. The economic messaging battle, looking at data as rhetoric. Next up, the broadcast grabs onto real-time economic data to validate this tough foreign policy stance and to take a swing at the opposing party's track record while they're at it. They enthusiastically point out that the Dow Jones soared to nearly 52,000. Their argument here is that global markets are just absolutely roaring in approval of this diplomatic breakthrough in Geneva. At the exact same time, they highlight a second major economic indicator, oil prices tumbling below $80 a barrel. They claim this drop is a direct result of easing fears over the Strait of Hormuz, all thanks to that newly secured 60-day ceasefire. The narrative they're building is that this geopolitical maneuvering is instantly translating into real, immediate economic wins for everyday Americans. And to really hammer that point home, they deliberately pair those dropping oil prices with a rather clunky television interview by House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries. They play a clip of him fumbling over questions about gas prices under the Obama and Biden administrations. By showing this, the broadcast is basically claiming that Democrats are frantically losing their economic talking points now that prices are supposedly dropping under different leadership. Which brings us to a really critical pivot point in the broadcast's argument. If this economic data is being framed as a massive loss for Democrats, how does the source claim they're adjusting their political strategy to actually survive? That takes us to Section 4, Critiquing Political Strategy, subtitled Abandoning the Moral High Ground. Here we see their final and honestly, probably their most aggressive critique. The explainer shows how the source argues that the Democratic Party has entirely ditched decency and norms in a desperate grab for power. They play the specific soundbite from a Democratic commentator on another network and use it to assert that the left is now essentially saying the quiet part out loud. They frame this as a flat-out admission that the opposition's strategy isn't about morals or democracy anymore, it's purely about getting and holding on to power. The host then goes after specific policy framings from the left to back up this big claim. They zero right in on an argument from Congressman Summer Lee where she suggests that opposing a multi-billion-dollar reparations payout is actually a secret plot to take over school boards and disenfranchise voters. The broadcast vigorously attacks this framing. They label it an insulting, extreme conspiracy theory rather than a valid, good-faith policy disagreement. To really put a bow on this harsh critique, they play one final audio clip. They use it to claim that extreme, anti-democratic views are now exactly what gets applause on the left. The whole implication here is that the opposing side is literally cheering for the criminalization of their political rivals, painting this picture of an opposition totally out of touch with everyday American values. This summary perfectly captures their overarching narrative goal. It's all about the contrast. On one side, you have their portrayal of the right, delivering lower gas prices, securing peace by stopping a nuclear Iran, and celebrating patriotism. On the other side, you've got their portrayal of the left, abandoning the moral high ground, inventing wild conspiracies, and trying to criminalize opponents. Now, whether you agree with the politics or not, you really have to recognize how effectively this broadcast uses carefully curated media to define its political enemy while presenting its own side as the ultimate beacon of common sense and results. And finally, Section 5, the local teaser, also known as the Spencer Pratt cliffhanger. Before they sign off, the broadcast gives us some major tonal whiplash. They abruptly pivot from these massive geopolitical treaties to drop a super dramatic teaser for a local political race. They introduce this Spencer Pratt cliffhanger. Pratt, who was already eliminated from the mayoral runoff, is suddenly back in the headlines. He's claiming he has a secret tape that will blow the upcoming November race wide open. And get this, the kicker is that just hours after he drops this warning video, a fire mysteriously breaks out at his business office. It's just a classic, sensational cliffhanger designed to keep the audience hooked and drive immediate clicks to whatever content they put out next. Which leaves us with a really crucial question to ponder. As you consume modern media, no matter where it falls on the political spectrum, ask yourself, how are these carefully constructed dichotomies and isolated clips working behind the scenes to influence exactly how you view the world? We've just seen the playbook in action. By understanding how these narratives are built, we can all become much more informed and critical consumers of the information we see every day. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and remember to keep questioning what you watch.